Forest mysteries. The highway was a scar of black ice cutting through the white. Mark kept his hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel, the way they taught you in trucking school 20 years ago, and watched the snow pile on the edges of the windshield. The wipers dragged across the glass with a tired squeak every 3 passes. He didn't mind the sound. It was something to measure time by. 5 years. He had driven this stretch of the 97 more times than he could count, hauling lumber from Prince George down to Kamloops, sometimes pushing through to the coast if the money was right. Tonight the trailer was empty, just the weight of the Peterbilt and the hum of the tires on compacted snow. The cab smelled like coffee gone cold, and the pine air freshener he'd hung from the rearview mirror last summer. It had stopped working months ago, but he never threw out. The radio was off. He turned it off somewhere north of Canal and hadn't bothered to switch it back on. The silence in the cab was thick enough to lean on. Outside, the wind was picking up, pushing streams of white across the asphalt like rivers of smoke. He checked the dash clock. 11:47 p.m. The hospital had called at 11:52. He remembered because he'd looked at the clock on the dashboard then, too, parked at a rest stop outside of Hope, arguing with the dispatcher about a late delivery. The call came through, and he'd let it ring. 3 times. 4. He'd watched the name on the screen and thought about how his daughter never called this late. But he was angry about the load, about the wait at the warehouse, about the 1,000 small cuts of a life spent on the road. So he let it ring. By the time he called back, she was already under. The car had hit black ice just like this, on a road just like this. She was 23. She'd been driving home from a friend's house, 10 minutes from her apartment, 10 minutes from being safe. The dispatcher got an earful after that. Mark didn't remember what he said. He remembered throwing the phone against the dashboard and watching the screen crack. He remembered driving through the night with no headlights for 47 miles because he didn't notice he'd turned them off. Now the snow was coming harder. The temperature gauge on the mirror read -22. He could feel the cold seeping up through the floorboards, the way it always did in this truck, no matter how many times he'd patched the seals. His knees ached. His back ached. Everything ached in the way that came from 56 years of living hard and sleeping worse. The road curved, and he followed it, the headlights carving a pale tunnel through the falling snow. Trees on both sides, black pillars of spruce and fir, leaning into the wind. He'd seen moose on the stretch before, bears in the summer. Once a lynx that crossed the road so fast he thought he'd imagined it. He thought about pulling over. There was a pullout 2 miles ahead, a gravel patch where drivers parked to sleep or wait out storms. He could shut the engine down, crawl into the sleeper, and let the snow bury him until morning, or until the fuel ran out. The thought came to him the way it had come every day for 5 years, not as a crisis, but as a low hum, a background frequency he'd learned to live with. His hand moved toward the gear shift. The shape appeared in the headlights without warning. White fur, a flash of gray, a body low to the ground, then rising, then falling. The thing came out of the tree line on the right, a blur of motion that didn't make sense until his brain caught up. Wolf. Big wolf, already mid-stride, crossing the road. Behind it, a smaller shape, a dark blur. Try keep up. Mark yanked the wheel left. The tires caught the shoulder, loose snow spraying up against the door. The trailer fishtailed, a sickening lurch that threw him against the seatbelt. He heard the crunch of something, a branch, a post, he didn't know, and then the truck was sliding, the world tilting, the headlights swinging across the trees in a wild arc before everything stopped with a jolt that snapped his teeth together. Silence. The engine had died. The lights were still on, pointing into a tangle of alder at the side of the road. Steam hissed from somewhere under the hood. Mark sat there breathing. His hand was still locked on the wheel. His shoulder hurt. His ribs ached where the belt had caught him. He blinked, trying to piece together what had happened. The wolf. He'd hit the wolf. He unbuckled and pushed the door open. The cold hit him like a wall, the wind driving snow into his face. He stepped down onto the shoulder, his boots crunching in the fresh powder, and walked around the front of the truck. The grill was dented but intact. The headlight on the passenger side was cracked but still burning. And then he saw her. She lay in the snow 10 feet from the front tire, a heap of gray and white fur that was too still. A wolf, yes, but bigger than any he'd ever seen. Her side was heaving, each breath a shallow, shuddering thing. Her back leg was twisted wrong, bones showing white through the dark fur, a slick of blood melting the snow around her. Beside her, no bigger than a house cat, a pup pressed itself against her belly. Dark fur, almost black, with a white tip on its tail. It was shaking, its mouth open in a sound Mark couldn't hear over the wind, a thin, desperate keening that he felt in his chest more than his ears. He stood there, the wind cutting through his jacket, the snow collecting on his shoulders. 5 years ago, a phone call. 5 years ago, a road just like this. 5 years ago, a girl who needed her father to pick up the phone. The wolf raised her head. Her eyes found his. Yellow eyes, the color of old amber, burning with pain and something else. Something that looked like a question. She was asking him what he was going to do. Mark looked at the pup. It had stopped crying and was staring at him now, its whole body trembling. He remembered the hospital, the white hallway, the doctor with tired eyes who said the words that split his life in half. The room where his daughter lay with tubes in her arms and machines breathing for her. The 3 days he sat there, holding a hand that never squeezed back. He'd been too late then. The wolf's head dropped back to the snow. Her eyes stayed on him. Mark walked to her. He crouched down, his knees popping in the cold, and put his hand on her side. The fur was thick, coarse, warm against his frozen fingers. She flinched but didn't snap. The pup pushed closer to her belly, whimpering. "Okay," he said. His voice was rough, cracked from silence. "Okay, I got you." He didn't know how he was going to do it. The truck was off the road. The storm was getting worse. He had no cell service, no supplies for this, no idea what he was doing. But he wasn't going to let another one die in the snow. He took off his jacket and laid it over the wolf, covering as much of her as he could. She made a sound, a low groan that vibrated through his palm. The pup burrowed into the fabric. Mark looked at the truck. The passenger door was still open, the cab lights spilling out into the snow. It was 30 feet away. It might as well have been a mile. He grabbed the wolf by the scruff of her neck and the loose skin over her shoulders, the way he'd seen men handle dogs, and pulled. She weighed more than he expected. 100 pounds, maybe more, dead weight in the snow. Her leg dragged, leaving a dark smear behind them. The pup followed, pressed against her side, its tiny claws scrabbling for purchase on the ice. His arms burned. His ribs screamed. The snow was up to his knees now, the wind driving into his face, blinding him. He pulled, one step at a time, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his grip slipping on her fur. 5 steps, 10, 15. He fell twice, went down on his knees, got back up. The wolf didn't fight him. She just lay there, watching him with those yellow eyes, trusting him to do what needed to be done. When he reached the truck, his arms were shaking so bad he could barely lift her. He got her front half onto the floorboards of the cab, then her middle, then her back legs, careful of the broken one. The pup jumped in on its own, a small dark shadow that disappeared behind the seat. Mark collapsed into the driver's seat, his chest heaving, his hands covered in blood and snow. He pulled the door shut, and the wind died to a low moan around the frame. The wolf lay across the passenger side floor, her head resting on his jacket, her breath fogging the air. The pup emerged from behind the seat and crawled onto her belly, finding her warmth settling into the curve of her body. Mark looked at the key in the ignition. He turned it. The engine coughed once, twice, 3 times, and then caught a rough, uneven rumble that sounded like it was dying. The heater pushed out a thin stream of lukewarm air. He had 2 choices: wait here for help that might not come before the fuel ran out, or try to make it to the hunting cabin he remembered from 10 years back, a place a friend had used before he quit drinking. It was 3 miles down a logging road. If the road was still there, if the cabin was still standing, if he could get the truck moving again. He looked at the wolf. Her eyes were closed now, her breathing slow and shallow. The pup was watching him, its nose twitching, its ears flat against its head. Mark put the truck in gear and eased off the shoulder into the white. The logging road had not been used in years. Mark knew that from the first 100 yards, when the tires sank into snow that had drifted across the tracks and frozen into ruts that grabbed at the wheels like hands. The Peterbilt groaned, the engine struggling to hold temperature, the heater pushing air that was barely warm. He kept his speed low, 15 miles an hour, just enough to keep momentum. The headlights showed him a tunnel of white. Snow falling, trees leaning, branches heavy with ice that scraped along the sides of the trailer like fingernails. The wolf had not moved. She lay across the passenger floorboards, her head on his jacket, her flank rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. The pup was tucked against her belly, its small dark eyes fixed on Mark whenever he glanced down. Blood had pooled on the rubber mat beneath the wolf's leg, a dark slick that was beginning to freeze in the cold seeping up from below. He had cranked the heat to full, but the cab was losing the fight against the storm. 3 miles. That was what he remembered. 3 miles down this cut, then a left at a clearing where Old Man Hargrave had parked his logging equipment 20 years ago. The cabin sat another half-mile beyond that, on a rise above a frozen creek. Mark had spent a weekend there in the late 90s, drinking beer with a guy named Pete who talked about buying the place. Pete was dead now. Liver failure, someone said. The cabin had probably sat empty ever since. The truck's engine coughed, a single hiccup that made Mark's hands tighten on the wheel. He watched the temperature gauge, the needle hovering just above the red. The fan belt was squealing. He had no idea how much fuel was left. The gauge had been unreliable for years, a flickering needle that told him anything between full and empty, depending on the slope of the road. He looked at the wolf again. Her eyes were open now, watching him. There was no fear in them, just a steady, animal patience that seemed to say she knew what was coming. The pup made a sound, a high, thin whine, and she turned her head, licking its face with slow, deliberate strokes. Mark watched her do it and thought about the hospital room, about his daughter's hand in his, about the machines that breathed for her while he sat there saying words she could not hear. The truck coughed again. This time the engine stumbled again. Mark pressed the accelerator, but the pedal went soft under his foot, the engine starving for fuel that was not reaching it. The headlights dimmed. The heater fan slowed, then stopped. The cab went quiet except for the hiss of wind around the door seals and the ticking of the engine as it cooled. He coasted for another 50 yards. Then the wheels bit into a drift and the truck stopped. Mark turned the key, but the starter only clicked. Dead, out of fuel, or the fuel line frozen, or something worse. It did not matter. They were stopped. The wolf stirred, a low sound coming from her throat, something between a growl and a moan. The pup pressed harder against her, its tiny body shaking. Mark sat for a moment, his hands still on the wheel, staring at the white beyond the windshield. He had no phone service. The storm was getting worse. The temperature inside the cab was already dropping, the cold creeping in through the floorboards, through the windows, through every crack and seam he had never bothered to fix. He thought about the cabin. A mile, maybe less. He had a flashlight. He had the wolf. He had the pup. He had no choice. He got out first, the wind hitting him so hard it pushed him back against the door. The snow was deeper here, up to his knees, and still falling. He walked around to the passenger side, opened the door, and looked at the wolf. She was 100 pounds of dead weight with a broken leg, and he had to carry her through a blizzard. He did not think about whether it was possible. He thought about the phone call he had not answered. He took the jacket from under her head and put on, zipping it to his chin. Then he reached in, got his arms around her chest and her haunches, and lifted. She made a sound, a sharp yelp that cut through the wind, and her head came up, her teeth bared for a moment before she seemed to understand what he was doing. The pup scrambled out onto his shoulder, digging its claws into his jacket, its small body pressed against his neck. Mark started walking. The snow was up to his thighs in some places, the drifts concealing fallen branches and frozen hummocks that made him stumble. The wolf hung heavy in his arms, her breath warm against his chest, her blood soaking through his jacket. He could feel her heart beating, fast and shallow, a hummingbird rhythm that matched his own. The pup was silent now, just a weight against his throat, its nose pressed into his collar. He fell once. His foot caught on something under the snow, and he went down, his knees hitting hard, the wolf sliding from his grip. He caught her before she hit the ground, pulling her back against him, his arms screaming with the effort. He stayed there for a moment, on his knees in the snow, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the wind driving ice into his face. The pup did not move. The wolf looked at him, her yellow eyes steady, and he got up. The cabin appeared out of the white like a ghost. A single dark shape against the trees, the roof sagging, the windows black. Mark pushed toward it, his legs numb, his arms no longer feeling anything at all. The door was frozen shut, but he put his shoulder to it, and it gave way with a crack of splintering wood, swinging inward into a darkness that smelled of dust and cold and something else. He stepped inside. The wolf's weight left his arms as he laid her down on the rough wooden floor. The pup jumped from his shoulder and disappeared into the dark. Mark closed the door behind him, leaning against it, his breath clouding in the freezing air. The cabin was small, a cast iron stove against the far wall, a table with 2 chairs, a bunk against the wall to his left, the mattress rolled up and tied with rope, a pair of boots by the stove, a can of beans on the table, a sleeping bag unrolled on the floor near the window. Someone had been here, recently. Mark's eyes adjusted to the dark, and he saw the wood stacked beside the stove, the matches on the mantel, the frying pan hanging from a nail. He was not alone in these woods, and whoever had been here was coming back. The fire took longer than it should have. Mark's hands were shaking, the cold sunk so deep in his bones that his fingers would not close right. He had to strike the match 3 times before it caught, and then he held it to the kindling with both hands cupped around the flame like a man praying. The dry spruce shavings took, a small orange bloom that spread to the split pine he had found stacked beside the stove. He fed it slowly, piece by piece, until the fire was steady enough to close the iron door and open the draft. The cabin began to warm, but the cold was old here, settled into the walls and floorboards like something that did not want to leave. Mark stood with his back to the stove, feeling the heat soak through his jacket, and watched the wolf. She lay where he had put her, on the floor near the stove, her side still heaving. The pup had crawled back to her and was pressed against her belly, its eyes half closed, its small body rising and falling with each of her breaths. The blood from her leg had spread, a dark stain on the wood that looked black in the firelight. The leg itself was wrong, the angle of it, the way the bone pushed against the skin from the inside. Mark had seen breaks before, working on trucks, watching men fall from loading docks. This was worse. This was the kind of break that did not heal without a surgeon and a steel plate. He looked around the cabin. One room, four walls of rough-hewn timber, chinking missing in places where the wind had found a way through. The bunk against the wall had a mattress rolled up with rope, and beside it a wooden crate with a lantern, a box of .308 cartridges, and a paperback with the cover torn off. The table held a single enamel plate, a cup, and the can of beans he had seen when he came in. The sleeping bag on the floor near the window was unzipped, the impression of a body still visible in the fabric. The boots by the stove were leather, size 10 or 11, caked with dried mud. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, or had not planned to be gone long. Mark walked to the window and looked out, but the glass was clouded with frost, the world beyond reduced to a blur of white and gray. He could see nothing. He could hear nothing but the wind. The wolf made a sound, a low whine that pulled his attention back. She was trying to lift her head, her neck straining, her eyes finding his. There was something in them that he had not seen before. Not the patience of the truck or the trail, but something harder, a demand. She was asking him to do something, and she did not have time to wait for him to figure out what. He knelt beside her, his knees cracking on the floor, and put his hand on her side. Her fur was matted with blood and snow, but beneath it he could feel her ribs, the hard knot of her spine, the flutter of her heart. The pup stirred, sniffing at his wrist, its nose cold and wet against his skin. He looked at the leg again. The break was open, the bone visible through a tear in the skin that had frozen at the edges, keeping the blood from flowing. He had seen wounds like this before on the job, on men who put their hands where they should not have. If the bone was not set, she would bleed out inside, slow and certain. He went to the crate and found a first aid kit, the kind that came with the truck, a green metal box with a red cross that had faded to pink. Inside, gauze tape, scissors, a plastic bottle of saline, a small bottle of iodine, a field suture kit he had bought years ago and never used. He laid it all out on the floor and then looked at the whiskey bottle on the table. Half full, cheap rye, the kind of thing a man left behind when he did not plan to come back. The wolf watched him. She did not move when he poured the whiskey over his hands, did not flinch when he uncapped the iodine and poured it over the wound. She made a sound, a deep vibration that Mark felt in his own chest, but her eyes never left his. He picked up the suture needle, a curved thing with a thread already through it, and he thought about the hospital room, about the doctors who had worked on his daughter while he sat in the hallway drinking coffee that tasted like hot water. He had not been able to do anything then. He had not been there when it mattered. He took hold of her leg above the break, and she went rigid under his hand. The pup scrambled away, a small dark shape that disappeared under the buck. Mark pulled, steady and slow, feeling the bones shift against each other, feeling her muscles lock against the pain. She did not bite him. She did not try to pull away. She lay there, her eyes on his, and let him do what he had to do. The bones seated with a sound he felt more than heard, a wet click that turned his stomach. He held it there, one hand above the break and one below, and with his wrist he pushed the gauze into the wound, packing it tight, pressing until the bleeding slowed. Then he took the needle and began to stitch. He had never sewn a wound before, had only watched, and his hands were not steady. But he worked the way he had worked on engines for 30 years, one piece at a time, slow and patient, not thinking about what he was doing, but only about doing it right. The wolf did not make another sound. She lay with her head on the floor, her eyes half closed, her breath coming in shallow huffs that fogged the air between them. Mark stitched until the wound was closed, a crooked line of black thread across the gray fur, and then he wrapped it with gauze and tape, tight enough to hold, but not so tight that he cut off the blood. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and looked at what he had done. It was ugly work, the work of a man who did not know what he was doing, but the bleeding had stopped and the leg was straight. He washed his hands in the last of the whiskey and poured the rest over the wound for good measure. And then he built up the fire and sat with his back to the stove, watching the wolf breathe. The pup came out from under the bunk and crawled back to her, finding the warmth of her belly settling into the curve of her body. Mark pulled the sleeping bag from the floor and draped it over them both, covering as much of her as he could reach. He was tired in a way he had not been in years, a bone-deep exhaustion that made his arms heavy and his thoughts slow. He thought about the boots by the stove, the sleeping bag, the can of beans. He thought about who might come back and when. He thought about his daughter's hand in his, the way it had felt small and cold, the way he had held it even after there was no one left to hold it for. The fire popped and settled, and the wind pushed against the walls, and Mark closed his eyes for a moment, just to rest them. A sound woke him, not the wind, not the fire, something outside, close, deliberate. A step in the snow that was too heavy for a rabbit, too slow for a deer. Mark opened his eyes, and the cabin was dark. The fire burned down to embers, and the wolf was on her feet, 3 legs braced, her head raised, a sound coming from her throat that he had never heard before, a low, rolling growl that seemed to come from the floor itself. The pup was pressed against the wall, silent, watching the window. Mark reached for the lantern, his hand closing on cold metal, and then he heard it again. A step, and then another, circling the cabin, slow and heavy, the snow crunching under something large. He held his breath and listened, and the steps stopped outside the window, close enough to touch, and for a long moment there was nothing but the silence and the dark and the wolf's low, endless growl. The sound had not come again that night. Mark sat with his back against the stove, the lantern unlit, the wolf's growl fading to a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He listened for 20 minutes, 30, his breath held in his chest, his hands loose at his sides because he did not know what else to do with them. The wind picked up again, pushing snow against the window, and whatever had been out there was gone or waiting or had never been anything but the wind playing tricks on a tired man. He did not believe that last one. Neither did the wolf. She stayed on her feet for another hour, 3 legs braced, her head toward the door, before she finally lowered herself back to the floor and let the pup crawl against her belly. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Mark learned to read the cabin by the light that came through the frost-glazed window, gray for morning, darker gray for afternoon, black for night. He burned the wood he found stacked beside the stove, then the wood from the crate, then the legs of the table when the storm did not stop and he could not get to the shed he had seen 50 yards behind the cabin. The beans he ate cold on the first day, standing at the window, watching the snow bury the tracks he had made coming in. The beans were gone, but there was rice in a glass jar on a shelf above the stove, and salt, and a tin of coffee that smelled like someone's memory of a better place. The wolf did not eat for 3 days. Mark boiled rice into a thin porridge and set it beside her in a chipped enamel bowl, but she only looked at it, her yellow eyes following his hands, her nose twitching at the steam. The pup ate. The pup ate everything Mark put down, rice, a piece of jerky from his pocket, the last of the saltines crushed into warm water. It grew bold in those first days, venturing away from the wolf's side to sniff at Mark's boots, to tug at the laces, to sit on his foot and look up at him with eyes that were turning from blue to brown. He started calling it Ash, for the color of its fur when the firelight hit it right. And the name stuck because the pup answered to nothing else, and Mark needed something to call it when it disappeared under the bunk, and he had to coax it out with scraps from his palm. The wolf took food on the fourth day. Mark had boiled the last of the rice into a thick paste and was sitting on the floor with the bowl between his knees, feeding ash from his fingers, when the wolf raised her head and looked at him. He held out his hand, the rice gray and steaming on his palm, and she stretched her neck forward, slow, her nostrils flaring. Her muzzle brushed his skin, warm and damp, and then her tongue was there, rough as sandpaper, pulling the rice from his hand in a single sweep. He filled his palm again, and she ate again, and when the bowl was empty, she lay back down with her head on her paws and watched him with eyes that had lost some of their hardness. That was the day he realized he had not thought about the highway in 4 days. He had not thought about the phone call, or the hospital, or the 3 days he sat in a plastic chair watching his daughter's chest rise and fall with the rhythm of a machine. He had thought about wood and water and the angle of the wolf's leg when she tried to stand. He had thought about Ash's ears, which were too big for his head, and the way the pup chased his own tail in the patch of firelight on the floor. He had thought about the boots by the door and the man who owned them, and whether that man would come back before the snow let up. He had not thought about Chloe. The guilt came down on him like a fall of rock, so sudden and so heavy that he had to put his hand on the floor to steady himself. 5 years of carrying her with him every mile, every night, every moment of silence between the hum of the tires and the static of the radio. 5 years of remembering the sound of her voice, the way she said "Dad," like it was the only word that mattered. And now he had gone 4 days without seeing her face. 4 days of sleeping through the night without dreaming of the hospital hallway. 4 days of being something other than a monument to a girl who was never coming back. He looked at the wolf. She was watching him, her head on her paws, her breath fogging the cold air between them. He had saved her. He had pulled her from the snow and carried her through the storm and stitched her leg with a needle meant for canvas and thread meant for skin. He had done for her what he could not do for his daughter. And now he was letting his daughter go, piece by piece, because this animal had taken her place in his hands and his head and the quiet hours between waking and sleeping. He got up and put on his jacket. The storm had stopped sometime in the night, the wind gone, the world outside gone still in that way that came after a heavy snow. He needed to get to the truck. He needed the supplies in the cab, the food, the batteries, the sleeping bag he had left behind when he took the wolf and ran. He needed to walk the 3 miles back to the highway and see if the road had been plowed, if anyone had come looking, if there was a world beyond this cabin and these animals and this second chance he had not asked for and did not know how to hold. He looked at Ash, asleep on the wolf's belly, and at the wolf herself, her leg wrapped in gauze that was stained yellow and brown, but not red, and he opened the door. The cold was a shock after the cabin's warmth. The air so dry it hurt to breathe. The snow had stopped, but the clouds hung low and gray, pressing down on the trees, and there was no sound anywhere except the creak of his boots as he broke through the crust and sank to his knees with every step. The truck was where he had left it, a white shape against the white of the road, the grill buried in a drift that reached almost to the windshield. He dug the door open and climbed inside. The cab smelled like frozen blood and coffee and the pine air freshener that had not worked in years. He found a sleeping bag behind the seat, a duffel with 3 cans of stew and a box of crackers, a flashlight with batteries that still had some life in them. He was reaching for the first aid kit under the passenger seat when he saw the tracks. They were fresh. The snow had stopped falling 12 hours ago, and the tracks were clean, the edges sharp, the crust broken open to the powder beneath. They came from the tree line on the passenger side, a line of prints that circled the truck, stopped at the driver's door, and then led back into the trees. Wolf tracks, but not like the wolf in the cabin. These were bigger, the span of them, The depth, the way they sank through the crust like the animal that made them carried weight enough to break the ice. Mark sat in the driver's seat with his hands on the duffel and watched the tree line through the windshield. He thought about the sound in the night, the steps that circled the cabin, the wolf's low growl that had not stopped until the steps did. He thought about the leg he had stitched and the wound he had closed and the pack that would not leave one of their own to die in the snow. He did not hear the wolf when it came out of the trees. He saw it, a shape of gray and black that moved without sound, walking the line of its own tracks back toward the truck. It was the size of nothing he had seen in years, its shoulders level with the door handle, its head low, its eyes fixed on the cab where he sat with his breath fogging the glass. It stopped 20 feet from the truck and looked at him, and Mark looked back, and for a long moment there was nothing between them but the snow and the silence and the understanding that this was not a threat. It was a question. The wolf turned and walked back into the trees, and Mark watched it go, and when it was gone he sat in the cold cab with the supplies in his lap and thought about the cabin, and the wolf with the broken leg, and the pup that tugged at his laces. He thought about the tracks he had found, circling the cabin in the night, patient and waiting. He thought about what it meant to save something and what it cost to keep it. The sound came from the east, a high, thin whine that cut through the morning silence like a blade. Mark was at the window before he understood what he was hearing, his hand on the frost-glazed glass, his breath held in his chest. The whine rose and fell. A sound he had not heard in years, but recognized the way a man recognized a voice from a life he had left behind. Snowmobile. Someone was coming up the logging road. The wolf heard it too. She was on her feet, 3 legs braced, her head turned toward the door, her ears flat against her skull. Ash pressed himself against Mark's ankle, a small warm weight that trembled with each pulse of the engine noise. Mark looked at the wolf, at the leg he had stitched, at the trail of blood she had left on the floor when she moved, and made a decision that came from somewhere below thought, somewhere in the muscle and bone of a man who had learned to hide what mattered. He pulled the sleeping bag from the bunk and spread it on the floor in the corner behind the stove. The wolf did not fight him when he lifted her, did not make a sound when he laid her on the bag and covered her with his jacket and the wool blanket he had found rolled up under the bunk. Her eyes stayed on his, yellow and steady, and he put his hand on her muzzle and said, "Stay," the way he had said it to dogs he had owned in another life, another time before the road took everything. Ash followed her into the dark behind the stove, a small gray shadow that disappeared against her side. The snowmobile was closer now, the engine noise louder, the sound of it bouncing off the trees and filling the cabin like something solid. Mark kicked the bloody gauze under the stove, pushed the suture kit into his pocket, and stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides, waiting. The engine cut out. Silence fell again, the kind of silence that comes after noise, heavy and expectant. Mark heard footsteps crunching through the crust, the sound of a man moving with purpose, and then a knock came at the door, 3 hard raps that shook the frame. Mark opened it. The man standing on the step was built like a stump, wide shoulders, thick arms, a face that had been out in the wind too long. He wore a fur hat with the flaps down and a canvas coat that had seen better days, and in his hands he carried a rifle with a scope that caught the gray light and threw it back in a flat green glint. His eyes moved past Mark into the cabin, quick and professional, the eyes of a man who counted things without seeming to look at them. "Didn't figure anyone would be up here," the man said. His voice was low, the kind of voice that came from a throat roughed by smoke and cold. "You the one left the truck on the logging road?" Mark nodded. "Broke down. Storm came in before I could get it moving." The man's eyes finished their sweep of the cabin and came back to Mark's face. "Elias," he said, and stuck out a hand that was cracked and calloused and cold as stone. "I got a cabin about 6 miles east. Saw your truck when I was checking my traps. Figured you might be dead. Mark took the hand. Mark, and I'm not dead. So I see. Elias stepped past him into the cabin without waiting for an invitation, the rifle swinging at his side, his boots leaving wet prints on the floor. He stopped in the middle of the room and looked at the stove, at the bunk, at the table with its missing legs. Hell of a place to winter. You a hunter? Trucker. I was coming down from Prince George when the storm hit. Elias nodded, his eyes moving to the floor, to the dark stain near the stove that Mark had not been able to wipe away. Blood, he said. It was not a question. Mark felt his pulse in his throat. Cut myself. Coming through the window. Elias looked at him for a long moment. Something in his face that might have been belief or might have been patience. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the light, his shadow falling across the floor. You picked a bad place to hole up. This cabin belongs to a man named Hargrave. He's been gone a long time, but people know it's here. You get transient sometimes. Drifters, not the kind you want to meet in the woods. I haven't seen anyone. No, Elias said. I don't suppose you have. He turned from the window, and his eyes went to the corner behind the stove, to the sleeping bag that was not quite flat, to the small movement Mark caught from the corner of his own eye, Ash's tail flicking out from under the blanket and disappearing again. You been here how long? 5 days, maybe 6. Elias walked to the stove and put his hand on the iron, testing the heat. You got enough wood? For now. Storm's supposed to swing back in tonight. Might be a bad one. You got food. Mark thought of the 3 cans of stew in his duffel, the rice in a jar, the crackers he had been rationing since the 2nd day. Enough. Elias looked at him again, that long, patient look that seemed to peel back the skin and look at what was underneath. I got a pot of stew on at my place. Enough for 2. You want to come up, get a hot meal, wait out the weather somewhere with 4 walls that don't leak. Mark shook his head before the offer was finished. I got things here. I need to stay with the truck. Elias nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has heard something that does not quite fit. Suit yourself. He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame, looking out at the trees, at the snow that was already starting to fall again, a few flakes drifting down from a sky that had gone from gray to white. You seen any wolves since you've been up here? Mark's mouth was dry. No. There's a pack works this valley. Been losing stock to them for 2 years now. Had a trapper up from Kamloops last month. Thought he could thin them out. He got himself mauled instead. Bad enough they airlifted him out. Elias turned and looked at Mark, his eyes flat and pale in the gray light. They say the one that did it was big. Bigger than anything they've seen in these parts. A rogue. The kind that doesn't stop until you put it down. Mark said nothing. His hands were loose at his sides, but he could feel his fingers wanting to curl into fists, wanting to close around something he could hold. Elias stepped out into the snow and pulled the door almost shut behind him, leaving a gap of gray light. You hear anything, you see anything, you don't go outside. You wait it out and you come find me when the storm breaks. He paused, and through the gap Mark could see his face, half in shadow, half in light. This place has a way of getting into your head, making you see things that aren't there. You keep yourself right, you hear. Mark nodded. Elias pulled the door closed, and the cabin went dark again, the only light the red glow of the coals in the stove. Mark stood in the center of the room and listened to the snowmobile start. Listened to the whine of the engine fade into the trees. Listened until there was nothing left but the wind and the sound of his own breathing. From behind the stove, a low growl began, a sound that came from the wolf's chest and did not stop. The days after Elias came were different. Mark felt it in the way he moved through the cabin, quieter now, his steps softer, his hand always going to the curtain he had hung across the corner where the wolves lay. He checked the window 3 times a day, for times watching the tree line for movement for the shape of a man or the shape of something larger. The snow had started again on the second day after Elias's visit, a light, steady fall that erased the tracks from a yard and left the world white and blank and waiting. Luna was healing. Mark saw it in the way she shifted her weight when she stood, the injured leg taking more of her weight each day, the swelling gone down enough that he could see the shape of the bone beneath the fur. She let him change the bandages now, without growling, her head turned away, her breath slow, and even while he unwrapped the gauze and checked the wound. The skin was closing, the edges of the stitches pulling together the way skin did when it was left alone to do its work. He had done a better job than he thought, or she was stronger than he knew, or both. Ash had no caution left at all. The pup slept on Mark's boot when the fire was low, followed him to the door when he went out for wood, sat at his feet while he boiled rice and beans into the same thin stew he had been eating for days. Mark found himself talking to Ash when the silence got too heavy, the way a man talks to a dog when there is no one else to hear. He told the pup about the road, about the loads he had carried, about the dispatchers who yelled and the warehouses that kept him waiting. He did not talk about Chloe. He had stopped talking about Chloe somewhere in the second week, and he was not sure if that was healing or forgetting or something else he did not have a name for. Luna watched him when he talked. Her head would come up off her paws, her ears forward, her yellow eyes fixed on his face with an attention that felt almost like understanding. She did not wag her tail or lick his hand or do any of the things a dog would do. She just watched, and that was enough. That was more than enough. On the 8th day after Elias left, Mark heard the snowmobile again. He was outside, breaking ice from the woodpile, his axe raised for another swing when the sound came through the trees from the east. He stood there with the axe in his hands and listened to it grow, the high whine of the engine bouncing off the trunks, and then he was moving, dropping the axe, pushing through the snow toward the cabin. He had the door open and was inside before the sound crested the rise. The curtain pulled across the corner, the sleeping bag rearranged to hide the shape of the wolf and her pup. Elias knocked this time. 3 hard raps, the same as before, and then the door swung open before Mark could reach it. The hunter stood on the step with his rifle across his chest and a canvas bag in his hand, snow collecting on the brim of his hat, his face flushed with the cold. "Brought you some things," Elias said, stepping inside without waiting. He set the bag on the floor and pulled off his gloves, his eyes doing the same slow sweep they had done before, taking in the stove, the bunk, the curtain Mark had hung across the corner. "Can meat, coffee, matches. You look like you could use a hot meal that isn't rice." Mark stood by the stove, his hands in his pockets, watching Elias's eyes. "I appreciate it." Elias nodded and walked to the window, his boots loud on the floor. "Storm's supposed to break tomorrow. Road's been closed since you came up, but they'll have it plowed by the weekend. You can get a tow truck up here, get that rig of yours moving." He turned from the window and looked at Mark. "You been seeing anything out there? Any sign of that wolf?" "No." Elias walked to the stove and put his hand on the iron, the same gesture he had made before, testing the heat, testing the life of the place. "Trapper I told you about, the one got mauled? He passed last week. Infection got into the wounds. They couldn't stop it." He looked at the floor, at the clean boards where Mark had scrubbed the blood away with snow and his own shirt. "They're going to bring more men up in the spring. Hunt it down. But I figure I can save them the trouble." Mark's throat tightened. "You've seen it. I've seen tracks. Big ones. Coming up from the creek, circling this ridge." Elias's eyes went to the curtain again, held there for a moment too long. Whatever did that to the trapper is still out there, and it's not going to stop until someone stops it. Mark opened his mouth to say something, anything, but before he could find the words, a sound came from behind the curtain. A whimper, high and thin, and unmistakably the sound of a pup. Elias's head turned. His hand went to the rifle, not lifting it, just resting there, the way a man touches something he might need. What have you got back there? Nothing. Mark's voice came out harder than he meant it to. It's nothing. Elias took a step toward the curtain, and Luna answered him. The growl came from deep in her chest, a sound Mark had heard only once before, the night the thing circled the cabin in the dark. It rolled through the room like thunder, low and long and full of something that was not fear. Elias stopped. His hand tightened on the rifle. "That's a wolf," he said. It was not a question. "She's hurt." Mark moved between Elias and the curtain, his hands out, his palms open. "I found her on the road. She was dying. I couldn't leave her." Elias stared at him for a long moment, and Mark watched something shift in the hunter's face, something that went from surprise to understanding to something harder, something that looked like judgment. "You've been hiding a wolf in here. That whole time, you've been lying to me. She's not the one you're looking for. You don't know that." Elias's voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man who had made his mind up and was not going to change it. "You don't know anything about her. She could be the one that killed the trapper. She could be the one taking livestock, and you've been keeping her alive. She has a pup." Mark's voice cracked on the word. "She was hit by a truck. Her leg was broken. She was bleeding out in the snow, and I..." The sound came from outside. A crack, sharp and sudden, the sound of something breaking through the crust of the snow, something heavy moving fast. It came from the tree line, from the direction of the creek, and it was close enough that both men turned toward the window. Elias had the rifle up before Mark could move, the barrel aimed at the glass, his cheek pressed against the stock. They stood there, two men in a frozen cabin, and listened to the silence that followed. The pup whimpered again, and the wolf's growl deepened, and Mark felt something in his chest pull tight, some wire that had been strung between him and the animals behind the curtain, some connection he had not asked for and could not explain. Something moved in the trees, gray against white, a shape that was there and then gone, too fast to be a deer, too big to be anything else. Elias tracked it with the rifle, his breathing slow and even, his finger resting on the trigger guard. "Get back," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Get away from the window." Mark did not move. He looked at the trees, at the place where the shape had been, and he thought about the tracks he had found around the truck, the steps that had circled the cabin in the night, the wolf that had stood on the road, and looked at him with eyes that asked a question he still did not know how to answer. The shape came out of the trees again, closer this time, and Mark saw it clearly for the first time. A wolf, gray and black, its shoulders level with his chest, its head low, its eyes fixed on the cabin. It was bigger than Luna, bigger than any wolf he had ever seen. It stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cabin, and Mark knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere below thought, that it was not here for him. Elias's finger moved to the trigger. "Get back," he said again, and this time there was something in his voice that made Mark turn. The rifle was pointed at the window, but Elias was looking at the curtain, at the corner where Luna lay with her pup against her belly, at the place where the sound had come from. Mark stepped forward, putting himself between the rifle and the curtain, his hands still open, his palms still empty. "No," he said, "she's not the one." The wolf outside howled. The sound rose through the cabin, through the walls, through the frozen air, a long rolling cry that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Luna answered from behind the curtain, her voice weaker, but just as fierce. Two calls that met in the middle of the room and hung there like something solid. Elias's eyes went from the curtain to the window and back again. His finger was still on the trigger, but he was not shooting, and Mark knew that the moment was balanced on something small, something that could tip either way. The howl came again, closer this time, and then there was another sound, a sound that Mark felt before he heard it, a vibration that came up through the floor and into his boots. The ground shook, a low rumble that grew into a roar, and Elias turned away from the curtain and looked out the window with his mouth open. The ridge above the cabin was moving. A wall of snow was coming down the slope, trees disappearing into it, the whole mountain sliding toward them in a wave of white that filled the window from one edge to the other. Mark saw it and knew what it was and knew there was no time to run. He grabbed Elias by the coat and pulled him away from the window, toward the stove, toward the corner where the wolves lay, and then the world went white and the sound swallowed everything. The sound went on longer than Mark thought possible, a grinding roar that vibrated through the floor and into his bones. He lay with his arms over his head, Elias's coat in his fists, the world reduced to noise and cold and the dark behind his closed eyes. Then the roar stopped, and the silence that followed was so complete he could hear the blood moving in his ears. He opened his eyes. The cabin was dark, the window buried, the door blocked by something solid. The only light came from the stove, a red glow that threw shadows across the walls. Elias was beside him, on his knees, his face pale in the dim light, his rifle on the floor where it had fallen. Behind the curtain, Luna was silent. Mark could hear Ash whimpering, a thin sound that cut through the quiet. Elias stood up slowly, his hand going to his side where he had hit the floor. He looked at the buried window, at the door that would not open, and then at the curtain. "You and me," he said, his voice flat, "we're going to have a talk about what you've been hiding." Mark got his feet. His ribs ached where he had landed, and his head was ringing, but he put himself between Elias and the curtain the same way he had before. "There's nothing to talk about. You've been keeping a wolf in here, a wild animal, in a cabin the size of truck bed, with a pup." Elias's voice was rising, the control he had worn like a coat starting to crack. "That wolf outside, the one that came down to the cabin, that's the one I'm after. And you got her mate in here, or her pup, or something that's going to bring that thing right to our door." "The avalanche already brought it down," Mark said. "We're trapped, all of us. Killing her won't change that." Elias took a step forward. "You don't know what you're dealing with. I've been in these woods 20 years. I've seen what wolves do when they get a taste for blood. They don't stop. They don't quit. And that one," he pointed at the curtain, "she's the reason it's here. You think it came down the mountain because of the storm? It came for her." Mark heard what Elias was saying, and some part of him knew there was truth in it. The wolf outside had been circling for days, watching, waiting. It had followed Luna's scent to the cabin, followed the blood trail from the highway, followed something Mark did not have a name for. But the truth did not matter. What mattered was the warm weight behind the curtain, the yellow eyes that had watched him in the dark, the pup that slept on his boot. "She's not the one you want," Mark said. "The one that attacked the trapper is still out there. You saw it. Bigger than her. Meaner. She's just trying to keep her pup alive." Elias stared at him for a long moment, and Mark saw something in the hunter's face that he had not seen before. Not anger, not judgment, but something older and colder. Fear. Elias was afraid, not of the wolf behind the curtain, but of what the wolves represented. The wild, the uncontrollable, the thing that had taken a man he knew and left him to die in the snow. "You don't get it," Elias said, his voice dropping to something almost soft. "That wolf outside, she's the one I've been tracking. I've seen her kills. I've seen what she leaves behind. And if she's here, it's because she wants something in this cabin. Maybe it's the pup. Maybe it's the female. But she's not going to leave until she gets it." He picked up his rifle from the floor. "And I'm not going to let her have either of them." Mark moved before he thought. His hand closed on the barrel of the rifle, pushing it up, and Elias's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot went into the ceiling, a crack of thunder in the small space. And then they were grappling, Two men who had both spent their lives doing hard work in cold places, their breath fogging in the dim light, their boots sliding on the icy floor. The rifle went off again, the bullet burying itself in the wall behind the stove, and then Mark had Elias's wrist in both hands and was driving him back into the table, into the bunk, until they fell together in a heap against the buried door. Above them, something crashed through the window. Mark looked up and saw it coming through the frame, a mass of gray fur and teeth that filled the cabin with a sound like nothing human. The rogue wolf had found a way in, through the window that had been cracked by the avalanche, through the boards that had given way under the weight of snow and rage. It landed on the floor with a crash and stood there, its head low, its eyes fixed on the curtain behind the stove. Elias scrambled for the rifle. Mark grabbed for it too, but his hand closed on nothing, and then the wolf was moving, not toward him but toward the curtain, toward the corner where Luna lay with Ash pressed against her belly. The curtain came down. Luna was on her feet, her bad leg folded beneath her, her teeth bared, her body a wall between the rogue and the pup. She was half its size, still weak from the surgery, but she did not back away. The rogue lunged, and Luna met it, and the two wolves came together in a snarl of fur and blood that rolled across the floor of the cabin. Mark was on his feet, the rifle in his hands, but he could not shoot. The wolves were too close, too fast, their bodies a single twisting shape in the dim light. He saw teeth close on Luna's shoulder, saw her twist and bite back, saw the rogue shake her like a dog with a rat and throw her against the stove. The iron rang with the impact, and Luna fell, her legs folding, her blood black in the firelight. Ash was screaming, a high, thin sound that came from somewhere under the bunk. The rogue turned toward the sound, and Mark saw its eyes for the first time. Yellow like Luna's, but flat, empty, the eyes of something that had stopped being an animal and become something else. It took a step toward the bunk, and Mark raised the rifle. He did not think about what he was doing. He thought about the highway, about the snow, about the phone he had not answered. He thought about the wolf's eyes in the headlights, asking him what he was going to do. He thought about the pup that slept on his boot, and the leg he had stitched, and the 5 years he had spent being nothing but a monument to a girl who was gone. He pulled the trigger. The rogue wolf fell, a red bloom opening on its side, and Mark stood in the center of the cabin with the rifle in his hands and watched it struggle to get up. Elias was beside him, then his hand on the barrel, pushing it down. "Enough," the hunter said. "It's done." The rogue wolf lay still. Mark looked at Luna, crumpled against the stove, her side heaving, a wounder neck that was bleeding too fast. Ash was out from under the bunk, pressed against her, his small body trembling. Mark dropped the rifle and went to her, his knees hitting the floor, his hands finding her fur. She was warm, still warm, but the blood was everywhere, soaking into the floor, into his hands, into the sleeping bag he had laid beneath her. Elias stood over him, watching. The rifle was in his hands again, but he was not pointing it at anything. He looked at Luna, at the rogue, at the pup that was trying to crawl into Mark's lap. "She's not going to make it," he said. "Not with a wound like that." Mark did not answer. He pressed his hands against the wound in Luna's neck, pressing the way he had pressed on the highway, the way he had pressed on the cabin floor when he stitched her leg. The blood came through his fingers, hot and thick, and he pressed harder, his arms shaking with the effort. Luna's eyes found his, yellow like they had been on the road, like they had been in the cab, like they had been every time she had looked at him since the night he pulled her from the snow. There was no pain in them now, just something that looked like peace, like she had done what she needed to do. Mark pressed his forehead against her fur and did not let go. Elias left in the night. Mark woke to find the cabin door open. A tunnel dug through the snow where the hunter had carved his way out, The tracks leading east toward his own cabin or toward the road or toward somewhere else entirely. The rifle was gone. The canvas bag with the canned meat and coffee was still on the floor where Elias had dropped it before the avalanche hit. Mark looked at it and then at Luna, and he did not think about Elias again. The wolf lay where she had fallen, her head on Mark's jacket, her breathing so shallow he had to put his hand on her side to know she was still alive. The wound in her neck had stopped bleeding sometime in the hours after the fight, the blood drying to a black crust that cracked when she moved. He had cleaned it with the last of the iodine, had wrapped it with the last of the gauze, had done what he could with what he had. It was not enough. He could see the redness spreading from the wound, the flesh around it hot to the touch, the infection setting in the way infection set in when a man tried to stitch a wolf with a needle meant for canvas. Ash stayed with her. The pup did not leave her side, did not eat when Mark put food down, did not come when Mark called. He lay against her belly, his small body rising and falling with each of her breaths, his nose pressed into her fur. Mark sat on the floor beside them and watched the fire burn down and the light through the buried window fade from gray to black. And he tried to think of something he could do that he had not already done. The food ran out on the third day after the avalanche. The canned meat Elias had brought was gone, eaten cold from the can, shared with Ash in small pieces that the pup took from Mark's palm without looking at him. The rice was gone. The crackers were gone. Mark boiled snow for water and drank it hot, and he fed the pup the same, dipping his finger in the cup and letting Ash lick it clean. Luna did not drink. He tried to lift her head, to pour water in her mouth, but she would not take it. Her jaws clenched, her eyes closed. The water ran down her neck and soaked into the jacket beneath her head, and Mark wiped it away with his sleeve and tried again and again until his arms ached and his hands shook, and he had to stop because he could not see what he was doing through the water in his eyes. On the fifth day, the thaw came. Mark heard it before he saw it, a sound that did not belong in the world he had been living in for the past weeks. Dripping, water falling from a roof, hitting the snow, running in rivulets down the face of the buried window. He stood at the door and looked out at the trees, at the water running from the branches, at the gray sky that was not snow but rain, cold and steady, eating away at the drifts that had held them captive. The sound of it was everywhere, a constant patter that filled the cabin with something that was almost hope. He looked at Luna. She had not moved in 2 days. Her breathing was slower now, the shallow rise and fall of her chest so faint he had to hold his breath to see it. The wound on her neck was worse, the skin around it swollen and red, a smell coming from it that turned his stomach. He had done everything he knew how to do. He had pulled her from the snow and carried her through the storm and stitched her leg and fought for her when the fight came. He had given her everything he had, and it was not going to be enough. Ash got up that afternoon. The pup walked away from Luna for the first time since the fight, his legs unsteady, his head low. He came to Mark and stood at his knee, looking up at him with eyes that had lost their softness, that looked like something older and harder than a pup's eyes should look. Mark reached down to pick him up, and Ash led him, curling into the warmth of his hands, his nose pressed against Mark's wrist. He was heavier than he had been, the bones of him thicker, the fur on his back darker. He was growing. He was going to be a wolf. Mark held him and looked at Luna, and he knew what he had to do. He had been thinking about it for days, had been pushing it away, telling himself she would get better, that the infection would break, that she would open her eyes and look at him the way she had looked at him on the road, asking him what he was going to do. But she was not going to open her eyes. She was dying, slow and quiet, and the only thing keeping her in the cabin was him. He had pulled her from the snow because he could not let another one die. He had stitched her leg because he could not let another one go. He had fought for her because he could not let another one be taken. And now he had to let her go, not because he wanted to, but because keeping her here was not saving her anymore. He put Ash down and went to the door. The snow outside was soft now, the crust gone, the world turning to mud and water, and the first green shoots of something that might be spring. He stood in the doorway and looked at the trees, at the water running down the mountain, at the sky that was gray and open and waiting. In the distance, from somewhere deep in the valley, a wolf howled. Ash answered. The sound came from the pup's chest, a thin, uncertain howl that rose and cracked and rose again. And Mark turned to see Luna lift her head. Her eyes were open, yellow and faint, and she was looking at the door, at the light coming through it, at the world she had not seen since the snow buried them. Her ears moved, catching the sound of the howl, and she tried to get up. Mark went to her and put his hand on her side. "No," he said, "not yet." She looked at him, the yellow eyes that had asked him a question on the highway, that had watched him through the surgery, that had held him steady when the rogue came through the window. They were not asking now. They were telling. She was telling him that she had done what she needed to do, that the pup was grown enough, that the pack was calling, and that she was ready. He stayed beside her through the night. He built the fire up and boiled water and cleaned her wound one last time. And when there was nothing left to do, he sat with his back against the wall and held Ash in his lap and watched her breathe. The rain stopped sometime before dawn, and the clouds broke, and the first light of the sun came through the window, pale and thin, and fell across the floor where Luna lay. She got up. Mark watched her push herself on her 3 good legs, watched her brace against the wall, watched her stand with her head low and her sides heaving. She was thin, the bones of her showing through her fur, the wound on her neck a raw red line against the gray. But she was standing. She took a step, then another, her bad leg dragging behind her, and then she was at the door, looking out at the valley, at the trees, at the world that was waiting for her. Mark stood up. Ash squirmed in his arms, and he put the pup down, watched him run to Luna, watched her lower her head and lick his face with a tongue that was gray with dust and blood. He went to the door and opened it wide, and the cold air came in, and the light came in, and the sound of the valley came in, water running, birds calling, the wind moving through the trees. Luna stepped out. She did not look back. She walked into the mud and the wet snow, her leg dragging, her head low, Ash following close behind her. Mark stood in the doorway and watched her go, watched her stop at the edge of the trees, watched her turn and look at him one last time. He did not know what he expected to see in her eyes. Gratitude, maybe recognition, something that would tell him that she knew what he had done for her, that it mattered, that the 5 years of silence and the phone call he had not answered and the daughter he had not saved had been redeemed in the weeks he spent with a wolf in a cabin in the snow. But there was none of that. There was only the yellow eyes, steady and wild, looking at him for a moment before she turned and disappeared into the trees. Ash went with her, a small gray shape that was gone before Mark could call his name. He stood in the doorway for a long time after they left. The sun was higher now, the light stronger, the snow melting off the roof in sheets that fell with a sound like breaking glass. Somewhere in the valley, a wolf howled, and another answered, and the sound of them rose into the morning like something that had always been there and would always be there, whether he was there to hear it or not. Mark went back inside and sat on the floor beside the cold stove, and for the first time in 5 years, he let himself cry. Mark woke to the sound of dripping water and the smell of mud. The cabin was no longer a prison of ice and snow. Water ran down the walls in thin streams, pooling on the floor, soaking into the wood. The window that had been buried for weeks showed a slice of gray sky and the dark branches of trees shedding their winter coats. He sat up slowly, his back aching from the floor where he had slept, and looked at the empty space beside the stove where Luna had lain. She was gone. Ash was gone. They had been gone for 3 days now. And still he looked for them when he woke, his eyes going to the corner, his hand reaching for the warmth that was not there. The cabin felt larger than it had before, the walls farther apart, the ceiling higher, the silence heavier. He had grown used to the sound of Ash's claws on the floor, the rhythm of Luna's breathing, the small sounds of life that had filled the space between the walls. Now there was nothing but the drip of water and the wind in the trees. He stood up and went to the door. The snow was retreating, the ground showing through in patches of brown and gray, the first green shoots of grass pushing up through the melt. The logging road was visible again, a track of mud and standing water that led back toward the highway. His truck was still there, he knew. He had walked out to it 2 days ago, had found it sitting where he left it, the grill buried in what was now a puddle of slush, the cab cold and empty. The battery was dead. The fuel lines were frozen. It would not move until a tow truck came, and the tow truck would not come until the road was open, and the road would not open until the thaw was complete. He had time, more time than he wanted, more time than he knew what to do with. The days stretched out in front of him, empty and quiet, and he did not know how to fill them. For weeks, every hour had been filled with something: wood to cut, water to boil, wounds to tend, lives to keep alive. Now, there was nothing to do but wait, and waiting was the thing he had been running from for 5 years. He walked to the creek that ran behind the cabin, following the path he had trampled through the snow weeks ago. The ice was breaking up, sheets of it floating downstream, catching on rocks and logs and piling up in the bends. The water ran fast and brown, carrying the winter away with it. He stood on the bank and watched it go, and he thought about the wolves. He had seen them once since they left. 2 days ago, the morning after they walked out, he had gone to the creek for water and looked up to see Luna standing on the far bank, her head turned toward the cabin, Ash pressed against her side. She was thin, her ribs showing through her coat, her bad leg held off the ground, but she was standing. She looked at him for a long moment, the yellow eyes he had come to know better than his own face. And then she turned and limped into the trees, Ash following close behind. He had not seen her since. He went back to the cabin and began to put things in order. He swept the floor, pushing the dust and the dried blood and the bits of fur into a pile and carrying it outside. He stacked the wood that was left beside the stove, neat rows of split pine that no one would burn. He found a missing leg of the table under the bunk and nailed it back on, the hammer loud in the quiet space. He washed the enamel bowl and the cup and the plate and put them on the table, and when there was nothing left to clean, he sat down and waited for the road to open. On the 5th day after the wolves left, he heard the howl. It came from the ridge above the cabin, a long, low call that rose and fell and rose again. And Mark went to the door and stepped outside into the gray light of early morning. The mist was rising from the valley, the trees half hidden in the fog, and somewhere in the white, the howl came again, closer this time, and then another answered it, and another, until the whole valley was filled with the sound of them. He stood in the mud and the wet grass and listened. The pack was back. They had come down from the high country with the thaw, following the deer and the elk into the lower valleys. And they were calling to each other across the ridges and the creeks, telling each other where they were, what they had found, what they had survived. And somewhere in that chorus, Mark thought he heard a voice he knew. Not the deep roll of the alpha or the sharp bark of the young males, but something softer, something that had been quiet for a long time and was finding its way back. He walked to the edge of the clearing and stood at the tree line, his hand on the rough bark of a spruce, and he listened until the howls faded and the valley went quiet again. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin, and he began to pack. There was not much to take: his jacket, his gloves, the sleeping bag he had carried from the truck, the duffel with the empty cans and the boxes that had held crackers and rice. The suture kit, the flashlight, the photograph he had found in his wallet when he was cleaning the floor, the one of Chloe at her graduation, her cap crooked on her head, her smile wide and real. He had not looked at it in weeks. He had not needed to. She was with him in a way she had not been since the road took her. Not in the guilt or the silence or the empty miles, but in the work he had done, the lives he had saved, the letting go that had come at the end of it all. He put the photograph in his pocket and walked out the door for the last time. The road was open. He could see the highway from the rise above the cabin, a black ribbon cutting through the white of the melting snow, a truck moving south, its lights cutting through the mist. The tow truck was coming. He had called from the cabin yesterday, using the satellite phone Elias had left behind, and the voice on the other end had said they would be there by noon. He walked down the logging road, his boots sinking into the mud, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. The trees were dripping, the water running off the branches in curtains that caught the light and threw it back in fragments of golden green. The snow was gone from the lower slopes, the first wildflowers pushing up through the dead grass, purple and white and yellow. The world was waking up, and Mark was waking with it. He passed the place where the truck had died, the Peterbilt sitting where he had left it, the windows clear now, the grill dented, the tires sunk in the mud. He put his hand on the hood and stood there for a moment, looking at the cab where he had spent so many nights, the sleeper where he had slept when he could not drive, the seat where the wolf had lain while he pulled her through the storm. It was just a truck now, metal and glass and rubber. It would take him back to the highway, back to the loads and the dispatchers and the miles, but it would not take him back to who he had been before. He walked on, to the highway, to the pullout where the tow truck was waiting, to the driver who leaned against the grill with a cup of coffee in his hand and a look on his face that said he had seen worse and heard more. "You the one with the rig on the logging road?" the driver asked. Mark nodded. "That's me." The driver looked at him, at the mud on his boots, at the weeks of silence in his face, at something that must have shown there, something that made the driver pause before he spoke again. "Long winter," he said. It was not a question. "Long enough?" Mark said. He got into the tow truck, and they drove back up the logging road, past the turn for the cabin, past the creek where the ice was breaking up, past the ridge where the wolves had howled. The driver talked about the weather and the road conditions and the other calls he had made that week, but Mark was not listening. He was watching the tree line, watching for a flash of gray, for the yellow eyes that had asked him a question on the highway and answered it in the spring. They reached the truck, and the driver got out to hook up the tow, and Mark stood on the shoulder and looked back at the road he had walked, at the cabin he could not see from here, at the ridge where the mist was lifting and the sun was breaking through. And in that moment, just before the light touched him, he saw her. Luna stood at the edge of the trees, 50 yards from the highway, her head high, her ears forward. Ash was beside her, no longer a pup, but something close to a wolf, his shoulders broad, his coat dark, his eyes fixed on the man who had carried him through the snow. They stood there for a long moment, the three of them, the sun rising behind them, the mist burning away, the world opening up in all its green and golden gray. Mark did not move. He did not call out. He stood with his hands at his sides, and he looked at them, and he let himself feel everything he had been holding back for 5 years. The grief, the guilt, the hope, the love. All of it came up from somewhere deep and filled his chest until he thought he might break with it. And then it passed, and there was only the morning and the light and the wolves at the edge of the trees. Luna dipped her head once, a small movement that might have been nothing or might have been everything. And then she turned and walked into the forest, Ash at her side, and Mark watched them go until the trees closed behind them, and there was nothing left but the road and the truck and the life he had to go back to. He got into the Peterbilt when the tow truck pulled it onto the highway, and he sat in the driver's seat with his hands on the wheel and looked at the road ahead. The cab smelled like pine and mud and something else, something that had been there for weeks and would stay with him long after the smell was gone. He put the photograph of Chloe on the dashboard where he could see it, and he started the engine. The road was open, the sun was rising, and somewhere in the valley behind him, a wolf howled and Mark smiled, and he drove. Summer came to the northern roads like a thing that had been waiting. Mark drove with the window down, the smell of pine and dust coming through the cab, the heat rising off the asphalt in waves that shimmered and danced. His truck was clean now, the grill replaced, the headlight fixed, the seals around the doors patched with new rubber that kept the wind out and the cold with it. The pine air freshener was gone. He had thrown it out somewhere in the spring, somewhere between Kamloops and Hope, and had not replaced it. The photograph was still on the dashboard. Chloe at her graduation, her cap crooked, her smile wide. He looked at it sometimes, when the road was straight and the hours were long, and he did not feel the weight he had felt before. He did not feel the guilt that had sat in his chest like a stone for 5 years. He felt something else, something that was not quite happiness and not quite sadness, but something in between, something that let him look at her face and remember her voice without the silence that had followed it. He was running a different route now. The dispatcher had asked him if he wanted to go back to the Prince George run, and he had said no. He ran the coastal routes instead, down to Vancouver and back, the mountains on one side and the ocean on the other. The roads were busier, the towns closer together, the nights shorter. He slept better. He did not wake at 3 in the morning with his hands reaching for something that was not there. The scar on his palm had faded to a thin white line, the place where Luna's teeth had grazed him when he lifted her from the snow. He touched it sometimes without thinking, running his thumb across the raised skin. It was a map of something he could not name, a record of a winter that had taken everything he was and left him something else. He did not talk about the cabin. When the dispatcher asked what had happened, where he had been, why the truck had sat on a logging road for 3 weeks, he said the storm had trapped him and that was the end of it. The dispatcher did not ask again. Men went missing in the north sometimes, and sometimes they came back, and sometimes they did not talk about what had kept them. It was the way of things. But Mark thought about it. He thought about it when the road was empty and the sun was going down and the shadows were long across the pavement. He thought about the weight of the wolf in his arms, the heat of her against his chest, the way her eyes had held him in the dark. He thought about the pup that had slept on his boot, the small warm weight that had grown into something that could stand at the edge of the trees and answer the call of the pack. He thought about the morning he had watched them go, the light behind them, the world opening up in front of them, and the way his heart had broken and healed in the same moment. He did not go back to the valley. He had thought about it in the weeks after the thaw, had even driven as far as the turnoff once on a run that took him north of Prince George. He had sat at the intersection with the engine running and looked down the logging road that led to the cabin, and he had seen the summer growth closing over the tracks, the alder and the willow filling in the spaces where he had walked. He had thought about the cabin, empty now, the wood he had stacked beside the stove, the floor he had swept clean, the photograph he had left on the table because it did not belong to him. He had thought about the creek and the ridge and the valley where the pack had howled in the morning mist. And then he had put the truck in gear and turned south because the road he was on was the road he needed to be on, and the road behind him was someone else's now. The summer haul was light, the load smaller, the days longer. He took a load of lumber from Vancouver up to a town called Hope, the same town where he had parked the night the phone rang, and he did not pull into the rest stop. He drove through, past the place where he had sat with his hands on the wheel and watched the screen light up with his daughter's name, past the place where he had let it ring, past the place where he had made a choice that had followed him for 5 years. He drove through, and he did not look back. And when he reached the other side of town, the sun was setting behind him, and the road ahead was clear, and the weight in his chest was lighter than it had been in years. It was late August when he saw them again. He was driving east, a load of produce from the coast heading toward the interior, the truck heavy and low, the engine working in the heat. The road ran through a stretch of forest that had been logged 10 years ago and was growing back, the new trees waist-high, the old stumps gray and rotting, the fireweed blooming purple along the shoulders. He had his window down and the radio playing something soft, something he did not remember turning on, and he was not thinking about anything in particular when he saw the shape at the edge of the trees. He slowed. The shape was gray, darker than the shadows, and it was standing at the tree line with its head turned toward the road. He knew it before he saw the second shape beside it, smaller, younger, its coat black in the fading light. He knew them the way he knew his own hands, his own face in the mirror, his own breath in his chest when he woke from a dream he could not remember. The truck was slowing now, the engine dropping to a low rumble, the tires humming on the asphalt. Mark looked at the wolves, and they looked at him, and for a moment the world was very quiet and very still. The photograph of Chloe was on the dashboard, the light catching the edge of it, her smile caught in the glass. The scar on his palm was a thin white line against the steering wheel. The air that came through the window smelled like pine and dust, and something that might have been the memory of snow. The younger wolf took a step forward, its nose lifted, its ears forward. Ash. He was bigger now, full-grown, his shoulders broad, his coat thick, his eyes the same brown they had been when he was a pup. He stood at the edge of the road and looked at the truck, and Mark thought he saw something in the set of the ears, the tilt of the head. That was the same as the pup that had slept on his boot in the cabin. Luna did not move. She stood behind Ash, her head level with his shoulder, her coat gray and silver in the late light. She was whole now, her leg healed, her neck clean, her body thick with the summer's feeding. She looked at the truck at the man behind the wheel, and Mark could not tell if she knew him or if she knew something else, something that looked like him but was not him. He did not know if wolves remembered. He did not know if what had passed between them in the cabin was something that stayed or something that faded with the snow. He put his hand on the gear shift. The road was empty ahead of him, the sun dropping behind the mountains, the first stars coming out in the pale sky. He could stop. He could pull over, open the door, walk to the edge of the trees. He could see if they would let him close, if they would come to him, if the winter and the cabin and the work he had done meant something that could cross the distance between a man and a wild thing. He kept his hand on the gear shift. He looked at the wolves, at the young one standing at the edge of the road, at the old one watching him with eyes that were yellow in the last light. He thought about the highway and the snow and the phone call he had not answered. He thought about the leg he had stitched and the pup he had fed and the morning he had let them go. He thought about what it meant to save something and what it meant to let it live its own life, and how the two things were the same in the end. He shifted into gear and pressed the accelerator. The truck moved forward, slow at first, then faster, the tires humming on the asphalt, the wind pulling at his sleeve. He watched the wolves in the mirror as they grew smaller, as they stood at the edge of the road, and watched him go, as they turned together and walked back into the trees. He did not stop. He drove with his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road. And he let them go the way he had let everything else go, not because he did not love them, but because loving them meant letting them be what they were. The photograph of his daughter was on the dashboard, her smile catching the light, and the scar on his palm was a line he traced without thinking, and the road ahead of him was long and empty and waiting. In the mirror, the tree line was darkening, the shapes of the wolves lost in shadows. The last light was fading. the sky going from blue to gray to the deep purple of a summer night, and Mark drove into it with his hands steady and his heart quiet and the road open in front of him. He did not look back. He had looked back enough.